The cold seeps through the thin wool of the dress, a stranger's dress that smells of lavender and terror. From her place on the cot, Alara watches a sliver of dawn pierce the grimy window of the cell, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the air. Each one is a tiny world, oblivious. The stone walls around her are absolute, the iron door a final, unarguable statement. It is the last dawn she will ever see. Her hand, hidden beneath the folds of the rough blanket, rests on the gentle curve of her belly. A life, secret and silent, stirs within her. 2 heartbeats in a cell meant for one. 2 souls paying a price set for another. The heavy tread of boots echoes down the corridor, the sound of hammer driving the last nail into her resolve. The jangle of keys is a death knell. She closes her eyes, not in prayer, but in a final, desperate communion with the child who will never know the sun. The swap was an act of madness, of grief so profound it mimicked courage. Now, madness has run its course, and only the consequence remains. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The cell door scrapes open, a sound of grinding finality. It is time. Sheriff Brody stands silhouetted against the weak morning light, his face impatient. As Alara forces herself to stand, her movements stiff and slow, she knows that only she, and the God she no longer speaks to, understands the truth. She is not just giving up her life. She is sacrificing a future, a legacy, a love she has only just begun to comprehend. And with that thought, the world she is leaving behind feels impossibly, cruelly beautiful. The town of Redemption Gulch had earned its name not through piety, but through the swift, unforgiving nature of its justice. It was a place carved from rock and dust, where survival was a daily sacrament and mercy was a currency few could afford. Alara had drifted into it 6 months prior, a ghost in a worn calico dress, her husband's memory the only possession of value she had left. He'd been a good man, a strong man, swallowed whole by a rockslide in a silver mine 2 territories over. His laughter was the first thing she forgot, the warmth of his hand the last. She arrived in Redemption Gulch with a spare shirt bundled in her arms and a new, terrifying secret growing within her. She found work as a laundress and mender, her fingers nimble, her presence so quiet she was nearly invisible. She moved through the town like a phantom, collecting linens from the boarding house, scrubbing shirts for the prospectors, her head bowed, her eyes downcast. The growing swell of her stomach was her constant, gnawing fear, a truth she concealed beneath loose blouses and a carefully draped shawl. To be a widow was pitiable. To be a pregnant widow with no family and no means was to be a pariah, a burden the town would not willingly bear. Her solitude was a fortress, her silence a shield. Inside, she was a storm of grief and terror, wondering how she could bring a child into a world that had already taken everything from her. Her work sometimes took her to the town jail, a squat stone building that brooded at the edge of the main street. She would collect the sheriff's laundry, the rough blankets from the cells, her face impassive to the jeers and desperation that stained the very air of the place. It was there she first saw Sadie Miller. Sadie was barely a woman, perhaps 17, with hair the color of straw and eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost childlike. She was accused of stealing a brooch from Silas Sterling, the man who owned the freight company, the general store, and nearly every soul in town. The brooch had belonged to his late wife, a fact Sterling repeated with righteous fury to anyone who would listen. The theft was an affront not just to his property, but to his hallowed grief, and he demanded an example be made. The circuit judge was due in a month, but everyone knew the verdict was already written. In Redemption Gulch, Silas Sterling's word was law, and the law demanded a hanging. Alara watched Sadie through the bars of her cell week after week. She saw the girl shrink, her youthful hope eroding day by day, replaced by a vacant, hollow-eyed resignation. The town buzzed with the story. Some whispered the punishment was too harsh for a piece of jewelry, but none dared say it too loudly. Sterling was a pillar of the community, a man whose favor could mean a line of credit through a hard winter, and whose displeasure could mean ruin. Sheriff Brody, a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for by Sterling's patronage, ensured the prevailing narrative was one of justified outrage. He would stand outside the saloon, his thumbs hooked in his belt, and speak of the sanctity of property and memory, his words fanning the flames of public condemnation. Scornful glances were cast towards the jail, not just at the prisoner within, but at the very idea of the crime, a symbol of the lawlessness that men like Sterling promised to keep at bay. One evening, as Alara delivered a stack of mended blankets, she found Sadie sobbing, her small body racked with tremors. The deputy on duty, a young man named Cletus with weary eyes and a weak chin, allowed Alara a moment. He was paid to be callous, but he hadn't yet perfected it. "He's gonna let me hang," Sadie whispered, her voice raw. "For a shiny pin. I didn't even take it. I was just cleaning the parlor when Mrs. Sterling's sister came to visit. She was looking through the jewelry box. When she left, Mr. Sterling started shouting. He said it was me." Alara listened, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She had seen the way Sterling's pinched-faced sister-in-law looked at the world, with the acquisitive glare of a magpie. The story rang with the hollow clang of truth. Sadie was a scapegoat, a convenient target for a man's rage and another woman's greed. "I have a mama and 2 little brothers back in the valley," Sadie choked out. "They think I'm working, sending money. This will kill my mama." In that moment, something shifted in Alara. Her own grief, a vast and desolate landscape, suddenly had a focal point. She looked at Sadie's terrified face and saw not a stranger, but a life that could still be lived, a family that could be spared a crushing sorrow. And she looked inward at her own future, a lonely, shamed birth, a child raised in poverty, another mouth she couldn't feed, another heart for the world to break. Her life felt like a closed book, its final chapter already written. But Sadie's was a story just beginning. A desperate, insane idea began to form, a seed of sacrifice planted in the barren soil of her despair. She had a little money saved, the last of what her husband had left her. Not much, but perhaps enough. The following week, she came to the jail again. Cletus was on duty. Alara didn't say a word, just pressed the folded bills into his hand. His eyes widened. It was more money than he made in 2 months. "Just look the other way," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "For 10 minutes. When you bring her food." He hesitated, his gaze darting down the empty corridor. He licked his lips, the internal battle playing on his face. Greed and fear warred with a sliver of conscience. Greed won. He nodded, a barely perceptible jerk of his head. Later that night, under the meager light of a single lantern, the swap was made. In the cramped, foul-smelling cell, they exchanged clothes. Alara's loose, drab dress fit Sadie loosely, while Sadie's simple prison-issue frock was snug on Alara, a fact she prayed no one would notice. "Go," Alara whispered, pressing a small bundle with bread and the last of her coins into Sadie's hand. "Don't run, just walk. Walk out of town and don't look back. Head south. Godspeed." Sadie stared at her, her eyes luminous with disbelief and a dawning, terrifying hope. Why? Why are you doing this?" Alara smoothed the rough fabric of the prison dress over her belly, a gesture of finality. "My story is over," she said, her voice flat. "Yours isn't. Now go." Sadie fled, a shadow slipping into the larger shadow of the night. Alara was left alone, the iron door clanging shut on her new reality. She lay down on the cot that was not hers, in a life that was not hers, and waited for a death that was. The initial awkwardness of the strange clothes and the cold stone gave way to a profound sense of peace. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt she had done something with purpose. She had traded her ruin for another's hope. It felt like a fair exchange. The first morning was the hardest. Alara awoke from a fitful sleep to the brutal reality of her decision. The air in the cell was thick with the smell of stale sweat and despair. A sliver of light from the high, barred window cut across the stone floor, a stark reminder of the world she had willingly renounced. For a terrifying moment, panic seized her, cold and sharp. Her breath hitched. What had she done? The frantic beat of her own heart was answered by a gentle, fluttering movement deep within her. The baby. Her hand flew to her abdomen, a desperate, protective gesture. In her grief-addled state, she had seen her life and her child's as a burden to be laid down. Now, in the stark light of day, she felt a flicker of something else, a primal, maternal instinct that recoiled from the finality of her choice. But then she thought of Sadie. She pictured the young girl walking south, the sun on her back, each step taking her further from this place and closer to her family. She imagined the relief on a mother's face, the continued innocence of two little brothers. The panic subsided, replaced by a grim, renewed resolve. This was not about her. It was about them. She had made a promise, a covenant in the dark, and she would honor it. The scrape of a key in the lock jolted her. Sheriff Brody filled the doorway, his bulk blocking the light. His eyes, small and hard, swept over her without a flicker of recognition. To him, she was just the condemned girl, a piece of administrative business to be concluded. Sterling wants this done the moment the judge arrives, he grunted, placing a tin plate of watery grits and a cup of rusty-tasting water on the floor. Don't cause any trouble. He saw a woman with straw-colored hair, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. He didn't notice that the eyes staring back at him were a different shade of blue, or that the frame beneath the shapeless dress was fuller, softer. He saw what he expected to see, a thief, sick with fear. He turned and left, the door booming shut behind him. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The first test was passed. She forced herself to eat the grits, her stomach churning. The food was nearly inedible, but she knew she wasn't eating for one. The thought was a paradox, an act of nurturing in the shadow of death. She was keeping her child healthy for a world it would never enter. The absurdity of it was a bitter pill, but she swallowed it down along with the tasteless gruel. The days that followed fell into a monotonous, soul-crushing rhythm. The cold of the morning, the long, silent afternoons, the terror of the night. The only breaks in the solitude were the guard's footsteps and the muffled sounds of the town outside her window. She learned to distinguish the rumble of freight wagons from the clatter of a lone rider. She heard the laughter of children playing in the street and had to turn her face to the wall, a wave of grief so intense it felt like a physical blow. She began to learn more about the case from the careless talk of the guards. They spoke openly in front of her, assuming the condemned girl was too lost in her own fear to listen. Sterling's still raising hell, one deputy said to another, his voice echoing in the corridor. Swears that brooch was the last thing his wife touched. You ask me, he cares more about his pride than his dead wife. Heard his sister-in-law, that Agnes, left town right after, the other replied with a snort. Said she was going to visit family back east. Convenient. Alara absorbed these fragments, piecing together the ugly truth. Sadie hadn't just been a scapegoat. She had been the perfect one. A poor, transient girl with no one to speak for her, caught in the crossfire of a family's petty greed and a powerful man's wounded vanity. This knowledge hardened Alara's resolve. Her sacrifice was not just for Sadie, but against the injustice that festered in Redemption Gulch, an injustice embodied by Silas Sterling. One afternoon, she received a visitor. The shadow falling across her cell was long and imposing. She looked up to see Sterling himself standing outside the bars, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. He was a tall, severe man in a well-tailored black coat, his gray-streaked hair brushed back from a high forehead. He looked at her not as a person, but as an object, a symbol of his restored authority. I wanted to see you one last time, he said, his voice clipped and precise. I want you to know that when you stand on that platform, the entire town will see what happens to those who disrespect what is good and proper. They will see that memory is sacred. That property is sacred. Your end will be a lesson. Alara looked back at him, her face a blank canvas. She did not plead or cry or rage. She simply met his gaze, her silence a wall he could not breach. Inside, her heart hammered against her ribs, but she would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. She held his gaze until he, unsettled by her lack of a reaction, was the first to look away. He gave a curt, dismissive nod and turned, his expensive boots clicking sharply on the stone floor as he departed. The encounter left her trembling, but also with a strange sense of strength. He had not broken her. He had not seen her. That night, a wave of nausea, more violent than any she had yet experienced, overcame her. She barely made it to the slop bucket in the corner. The on-duty guard, a brutish man with a tobacco-stained beard, heard her retching. "What's wrong, girl?" he sneered through the bars. "Justice turning your stomach? Or just scared of the rope?" She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and said nothing, retreating to the shadows of her cot. It was another close call. Her body was threatening to betray her secret, this living truth she carried in the face of their lies. The days bled into a week, then two. Alara grew weaker. The meager rations were not enough to sustain her, let alone the life inside her. Her dress felt tighter, the curve of her belly more pronounced. She spent her days angled away from the door, her blanket pulled high, praying no one would look too closely. Her internal world became her only refuge. She would lie on the cot for hours, her hand resting on her stomach, and speak to her child in whispers. She told him about his father, about the way he could gentle a nervous horse with a touch, about the sound of his laugh. She described the color of the sky in the high country, the smell of pine after a rain, the taste of wild strawberries. She gave the baby a world in words, a legacy of memories it would never have. These moments were her solace and her torture. The fierce, desperate love she felt for this unborn child was a searing fire, making her sacrifice feel more impossible with each passing day. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Sadie Miller. Sheriff Brody, in an act of casual cruelty, decided to read it aloud for the entertainment of the other deputy. "Listen to this, Cletus, from the little thief's mama." He read the letter in a mocking, dramatic voice. It was a simple, heartbreaking missive, full of love and worry, asking why Sadie hadn't written, praying she was well, sending the love of her little brothers. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking from the corners. She was not just an anonymous woman in a cell. She was the silent recipient of a family's love, the placeholder in their story. The weight of it was immense. She had saved them from the grief of a letter written by the sheriff, but she had taken on the burden of their affection. The town was buzzing with a new energy. A rider had brought news. Circuit Judge Elias Callahan would be arriving in 2 days. The news struck Alara like a physical blow. 2 days. The abstract concept of her own death suddenly had a terrifyingly concrete timeline. 48 hours. The countdown had begun. Judge Callahan arrived not with a thunder of hooves, but with the quiet dignity of a man accustomed to his own authority. He rode a sturdy gray gelding and was dressed in a simple, dark traveling coat powdered with the dust of the trail. He was older than Alara had expected, with a deeply lined face and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 grim stories. He was known throughout the territory for being stern, meticulous, and incorruptible. He did not dispense justice with the hot-blooded passion of a vigilante, but with the cold, dispassionate precision of the law itself. The town's leaders, including Silas Sterling, met him with a feigned deference that Callahan seemed to see right through. He checked into the boarding house, requested all the records pertaining to the case of Sadie Miller, and retired to his room, leaving the town to hold its breath. Alara felt the shift in the jail's atmosphere. The guards were more officious, their posture straighter. The finality of the proceedings was settling over the building like a shroud. She spent the next day in a state of suspended terror, her mind replaying her decision, her grief, her whispered conversations with her unborn child. Was this courage or the ultimate act of despair? She no longer knew. All she knew was that the path had narrowed to a single point, and there was no turning back. On the final morning, Sheriff Brody unlocked her cell. He was accompanied by a different deputy, one she didn't know. "The judge wants to see you," Brody said, his tone clipped, "before he signs the order. A formality. A formality." The word hung in the air. Her entire existence, and that of her child, reduced to a piece of paperwork. They led her from the cell, down the short corridor, and into the sheriff's office, which was being used as a temporary chamber. The room was stuffy, smelling of old paper and stale cigar smoke. Silas Sterling was already there, standing near the window, his arms crossed, his face a granite mask of impatience. And seated behind the sheriff's heavy oak desk was Judge Callahan. He looked up as she entered, and his gaze was not cruel, but intensely focused. It was the look of a man who missed nothing. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the ill-fitting dress, the pale, translucent skin, the straw-colored hair matted with sweat. Alara kept her eyes fixed on a point on the floor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to conceal their trembling. "This is the prisoner, Sadie Miller," the sheriff announced, a little too loudly. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. He continued to study Alara, a slight frown creasing his brow. He motioned to a simple wooden chair placed in the center of the room. "Sit, child." His voice was lower, deeper than she'd expected. It held no malice, only a weary command. Alara moved to the chair, her legs feeling like lead. As she sat, a wave of dizziness washed over her, a product of fear and malnutrition. The room tilted. Her vision swam. Instinct, powerful and irrefutable, took over. Her left hand shot out to steady herself on the edge of the desk, while her right hand flew to the gentle, undeniable curve of her belly, a gesture as old as time itself. It was not a conscious thought, but a purely maternal reflex, to shield, to protect, to ground herself through the life she carried. The loose prison dress, already strained, pulled taut across her abdomen for a single, revelatory second. It was all it took. The room was silent, but for Alara, the world seemed to roar. Silas Sterling hadn't noticed. Sheriff Brody was looking at the judge, waiting for his cue. But Judge Callahan was no longer looking at her face. His gaze, sharp and suddenly electrified with a profound, shocking intensity, was fixed on her hand, on the place where it rested. He was a man who had buried a young wife and the stillborn son she had died delivering. He knew the subtle architecture of a woman's body in that sacred state. He knew its secret shapes, its desperate gestures. What he saw in that fleeting moment was not the posture of a thin, frightened thief, but the unmistakable, protective cradle of a mother-to-be. A muscle twitched in his jaw. His eyes, which had been weary, were now alight with a dawning, terrible suspicion. He stood up slowly, his presence filling the small room. "Sheriff," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the silence. "Mr. Sterling, leave us." Sterling sputtered. "Judge, this is highly irregular. The matter is settled." "Now," the judge commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. He did not raise it, but its power was absolute. It was the voice of the law, unadorned and unarguable. Sterling's mouth snapped shut. He shot a venomous glare at Alara, then turned and stalked out of the room, the sheriff trailing nervously in his wake. The door clicked shut. They were alone. Judge Callahan walked around the desk until he stood before her. He did not loom over her, but crouched down, bringing himself to her level. His eyes, now closer, were not angry. They were filled with a deep, sorrowful gravity. "Look at me, child," he said, his voice gentle now. Alara forced herself to lift her gaze from the floor. She saw the intricate map of lines on his face, the profound sadness in his eyes. This was not a man who would be satisfied with a lie. "There is the town's truth, and then there is God's truth," he said softly. "The town's truth is what Mr. Sterling pays for. I'm interested in the other. I want you to tell me your name, your real name." The question, so simple, so direct, shattered the last of her defenses. The carefully constructed walls of her sacrifice, built of grief and resolve, crumbled into dust. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. A choked sob escaped her lips, the first sound of her own despair she had allowed herself to make in weeks. "Alara," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. "My name is Alara." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And the child you carry, Alara," he continued, his voice thick with a strange reverence. "Does he have a name?" The dam broke. The torrent of her story poured out of her. The swap born of desperation, her husband's death, the crushing loneliness, Sadie's terror, the feeling that her own life was already forfeit. She spoke of her sacrifice not as an act of heroism, but as the only logical choice for a woman who had nothing left to lose. She confessed it all, her words punctuated by ragged sobs of grief and fear and a strange, unburdening relief. Judge Callahan listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. He was a rock in the flood of her confession, his quiet presence a testament to the gravity of her words. When she was finished, her voice a raw whisper, the room was silent again. He remained crouched before her for a long moment, the weight of what she had told him settling between them. Finally, he rose to his feet. He looked down at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than sorrow crossed his face. It was a hard, cold anger, but it was not directed at her. "Wait here," he said, his voice once again the iron instrument of the law. "Do not move." He turned and strode to the door, pulling it open with a force that made it shudder in its frame. "Bailiff," he called into the corridor, his voice echoing through the silent building. "Reconvene this court. In the main hall. Now, and bring Mr. Sterling back. I'm not finished with him yet." The main room of the town hall, which doubled as a courtroom, was hastily reassembled. Word had spread like wildfire that something was amiss. The wooden benches were filled with curious townspeople, their faces a mixture of confusion and morbid anticipation. Silas Sterling stood at the front, next to Sheriff Brody, his expression one of pure, unadulterated fury at the delay, at the challenge to his authority. He believed this was some legalistic charade, a final, pointless hurdle before his will was done. Judge Callahan entered, his black robes giving him the appearance of a somber, avenging angel. He took his place at the raised dais, the great seal of the territory hanging on the wall behind him. He surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping over the expectant faces, lingering for a moment on Sterling, before finally coming to rest on the door through which Alara was being escorted by the bailiff. She walked slowly, her eyes downcast, the focus of every stare in the room. She felt their judgment, their curiosity. They still saw her as Sadie Miller, the thief. "Bring the prisoner forward," the judge commanded. Alara stood before him, her hands clasped, her head bowed. The silence in the room was absolute, thick with tension. Judge Callahan let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment build. Then he spoke, his voice clear and resonant, reaching every corner of the hall. "We are gathered here today to finalize the sentence of death upon the prisoner known as Sadie Miller for the crime of theft against Mr. Silas Sterling." He paused, letting the formal words hang in the air. "However, a court of law is not a theater for vengeance. It is a house of truth, and the truth of this matter is not what it appears to be." A murmur went through the crowd. Sterling's posture stiffened. "There's been a grave error," the judge continued, his voice rising in power. "An error born of cruelty, desperation, and a profound miscarriage of justice. Bailiff, have the prisoner raise her head." The bailiff gently touched Alara's elbow. She lifted her chin, her tear-streaked face exposed to the entire town. "I ask you all to look upon this woman," the judge declared. "This is not Sadie Miller." The statement landed like a thunderclap. The room erupted in gasps and confused chatter. Sheriff Brody took an involuntary step forward, his face slack with shock. Sterling's face, already pale with anger, turned a mottled shade of red. "This is madness," Sterling shouted, his voice cracking. "She confessed. She is the thief. She is a woman named Alara," the judge boomed, silencing the room. "A widow who, in an act of profound and misguided despair, traded her life for that of the actual defendant, who has long since fled this town's particular brand of justice. He proceeded to lay out the bare facts of the swap, his words precise and damning. He did not share the intimate details of Alara's grief, but he painted a stark picture of a system so cruel and a man so influential that an innocent woman felt her only recourse was to take a condemned girl's place on the gallows. Sterling, apoplectic with rage, strode toward the dais. "This is preposterous, a sentimental fantasy. I demand justice. This woman is an accomplice. Hang them both, for all I care." Judge Callahan rose slowly to his full height, his shadow falling over Sterling. His face was a thundercloud of righteous fury. "You demand justice, Mr. Sterling," he thundered, his voice shaking the very timbers of the hall. "You, who used your power and your grief as a cudgel to condemn a frightened girl without proper evidence. You, who were so blinded by your own pride that you could not even recognize the face of the person you sent to die. You speak of justice, but you crave only vengeance, and you will not find it in my court." He pointed a finger first at the sheriff, then at Sterling. "The law is not a tool for personal satisfaction. It is a shield for all, most especially for the vulnerable. And there are two legal principles at play here that you have, in your arrogance, forgotten. First, this court cannot, and will not, execute one person for another's crime, regardless of any pact made under duress. Second," he paused, his voice dropping to a low, powerful growl as his eyes found Alara's belly. "The laws of God and man, the very foundations of our civilization, forbid the execution of a woman who carries a child." He let that final statement settle. The revelation of Alara's pregnancy descended upon the room, turning confusion into stunned, awed silence. The women on the benches gasped, their hands flying to their mouths. The men stared, their hardened faces showing flickers of shock and a dawning shame. Alara's secret, the source of her deepest vulnerability, had become her ultimate, unassailable shield. "You sought to make an example of a girl, Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice now cold and sharp as glass. "Instead, you have made an example of your own callous disregard for the law I am sworn to uphold. You have shown this town that your pride is worth more to you than 2 human lives." He slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing the finality of his judgment. "The execution order for Sadie Miller is hereby nullified. I am placing this woman, Alara, under the protection of this court. Sheriff Brody, you will open a new, and this time thorough, investigation into the original theft, paying particular attention to the whereabouts of Mr. Sterling's sister-in-law on the day in question. As for you, Mr. Sterling, I suggest you retire to your home and contemplate the meaning of the word justice. This court is adjourned." Silas Sterling stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and public humiliation. The townspeople did not look at him with fear or respect anymore, but with a new, questioning light in their eyes. His power had not been broken by force, but by the quiet, undeniable truth of a woman's body and a judge's unyielding integrity. Alara stood between the bailiff and the judge's dais, tears of relief streaming down her face, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. For the first time, the life within her did not feel like a sentence, but a promise. The town's harsh judgment had been silenced, replaced by a profound and humbling miracle. In the quiet aftermath of the storm he had unleashed, Judge Callahan did not leave Alara to the mercy of the town. He bypassed the sheriff and the mayor, placing her directly into the care of the local preacher and his wife, a kindly couple named Henderson who lived in a small, clean house at the quiet end of town. The transition was a blur of kindness for Alara. One moment she was standing in the echoing courtroom. The next she was being led into a warm kitchen that smelled of baking bread and rosemary. Mrs. Henderson, a woman with gentle hands and eyes that held no judgment, helped Alara out of the filthy prison dress and into a soft, clean nightgown. She drew a hot bath and served her a bowl of thick, nourishing beef stew that felt like a benediction. For the first time in months, Alara felt safe. The constant, Gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long began to recede, leaving behind a vast, quiet space of exhaustion and profound relief. Later that evening, as Alara sat wrapped in a quilt in a rocking chair by the fire, Judge Callahan paid her a visit. He stood in the doorway of the small parlor, his hat in his hands, looking less like an arbiter of the law and more like a weary traveler. "Mrs. Henderson tells me you are comfortable," he said, his voice soft. Alara nodded, unable to find the words to thank him. "I am," she managed to whisper. "Thank you." He stepped into the room, his gaze falling to the slight swell of her abdomen, now visible beneath the soft folds of her nightgown. "You showed a strange kind of courage, Alara," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "The kind born of absolute despair. But it was courage nonetheless. However, the life you were so willing to discard has a value you are not able to see. And the life you carry, it has a right to be." He looked into the fire, a deep sadness momentarily shadowing his face. "Life is a precious, fragile thing. Do not be so quick to bargain it away again. Your child deserves a mother. And you," he looked back at her, his eyes clear and direct, "deserve the chance to be one." With those words, he seemed to grant her a permission she hadn't known she needed. Permission to live, to hope, to value herself. He was no longer just a judge. He was the man who had seen her, truly seen her, and affirmed her worth when she had none for herself. He left a small purse on the mantelpiece. "For the child," he said, before departing as quietly as he had arrived, his work in Redemption Gulch done. The days that followed were gentle. The town, shamed by the judge's rebuke of its most powerful citizen, left her in peace. Silas Sterling was a recluse in his large house, his authority fractured. The whispers Alara heard now were not of condemnation, but of awe and a sort of grudging respect. She was the woman who had faced the gallows, the woman who had carried a secret life. She spent her time helping Mrs. Henderson with small chores, her strength slowly returning. She learned to bake bread, her hands finding a new purpose in the kneading of dough. She sat in the small garden behind the parsonage, feeling the sun on her face, a simple pleasure that felt like the greatest luxury. She was no longer Alara the grieving phantom, or Sadie the condemned thief. She was becoming Alara, the mother-to-be, a woman defined not by her past, but by the future she now dared to imagine. One afternoon, sitting by the window that looked out not on iron bars, but on the vast blue expanse of the western sky, she felt a strong, definitive kick from within. She gasped and laughed, a real, unburdened sound. She placed both hands on her belly, a gesture not of sacrifice or of fear, but of profound and joyful connection. The setting sun bathed the room in a warm, golden light. She was no longer a ghost in a strange town. This small, quiet room was the first home her child had ever known. It was the first place she, too, had felt truly alive in a very long time. She had walked into a cell to die, but in the heart of that darkness, she had found a reason to live. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.